From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really delighted to see you all. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the African Middle East Division. And before I go any further, I would like to recognize my predecessor. Beverly Gray is with us today. She was Chief of the African Middle East Division. And I'm really delighted to welcome her here again. She's been my mentor. She's been the person who actually brought me to the library. So I'm really delighted to see her. There were a number of people I was going to recognize, and I'm just going to say they may come in a few minutes. One is Rita Balian, who has been a great supporter of the current Armenian exhibit, To Know Wisdom and Instruction, and the catalog that Levon Avdoyan prepared. She is probably on her way. And there were also two former ambassadors to Armenia who said they would join us. And so I would like to recognize them as well and to say, you know, welcome. Michael Lemon and John Evans said they were going to join us, so I hope they will be here. But last week, we launched a new initiative that we've called Highlights from the Collections of the African and Middle Eastern Division. Dr. Ann Brenner, who is sitting here, Hebraic Area Specialist in the Hebraic section of this division, whose idea it was, made the first presentation entitled From Spanish Court to Ottoman Palace, 16th Century Hebrew Books in the Library of Congress, which was followed by a display in our conference room. The idea behind this initiative is to highlight the knowledge and scholarship of the African Middle East Division specialists. The Library of Congress is not built only on collections of books, serials, photographs, maps, etc., but on the librarians who are the scholars who acquire, serve, and interpret those collections. Without their knowledge and expertise, there would be no library. It would simply be a book depot. A case in point is today's speaker, Dr. Levon Avdoyan, about whom you will hear more when Dr. Christopher Murphy, head of the Near East section, will introduce him. I just want to say that were it not for Levon, the Armenian collection at LC would be little known and probably quite insignificant. Today, thanks to him, his knowledge and scholarly expertise, the Armenian collection has been recognized as one of the premier collections in the world. The exhibit on the Armenian book, which he organized and curated, has been covered by the media worldwide and has resulted in numerous invitations to him, including to be a keynote speaker at the opening exhibit of the Manoogian Art Museum in Michigan, and also invitation to meet with Armenian scholars in Paris, to give a number of talks in Yerevan, all this fall. So Ahmed will have, throughout this year, presentations such as this one, in addition to our other programs, so that all may get to know our specialists and our collections. I would like to announce an upcoming program in the series in mid-September. Marita Harper and Dr. Angel Baptiste will have a program on the new state of South Sudan and will display rare materials that very few institutions apart from the Library of Congress hold, as well as the most recent publications and resources coming out of this new country. I would like also to point out that the catalog on the exhibit is for sale downstairs in the bookstore. So if after this program you're really excited about Armenian collections, you should see the exhibit, and then you should get the catalog. But now, let me, Dr. Chris Murphy, head of the Near East section, will introduce today's program. Chris?
Thank you, Mary Jane. And again, to all of you, welcome. And I will add to what Mary Jane said about how wonderful it is to have Beverly Gray here, our former chief of AMED. What can one say about Levon Avdoyan? I can say personally, I've known him since I came here 27 years ago, and his arrival in the Near East section as Armenian and Georgian specialist in, I think it was 1992, was in fact a great relief to me, because my predecessor, actually Lee and my predecessor, did both Armenian and Turkish. For the few of you that I haven't told, I was trained basically as a medievalist and a Central Asian specialist, coming to Turkey by way of that. So I had no ability, capability to do anything Armenian. So Lee's arrival was literally a godsend. And the work he's done since his arrival can only be called exemplary. I mean, he really is the model of what an area specialist should be and can be, and how much and how important the additions of knowledge about a subject can help to make a collection truly a great collection, and to be truly able to support research in many subjects at the highest level. Now, as for Lee himself, he received an MA, an MPhil, and a PhD from Columbia University in ancient history, having a minor in Armenian history and civilization. Following the completion of the doctorate, he had several traveling fellowships, and actually he was a graduate student too, including an IREX to Soviet Armenia in 72 and 73. He was the Gennadius Byzantine Fellow at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens in 73 and 74. And it should be noted that that is a very high honor, especially for a, who was then a relatively young scholar. And he followed that up as a junior fellow at Dunbarton Oaks in 76 and 77. He came to the library in 77, working in, of all places, decimal classification. He then moved on to be a reference specialist for classics, ancient history, and medieval and Byzantine studies in the main reading room, the Humanities and Social Sciences Division. And then in 92, much to my relief and gladness, he became Armenian and Georgian specialist in 1992. And I must say that from 92 until now, 2012, it's a relatively brief period as far as the Library of Congress is concerned, 2 decades. When I came here, John Finzi, who some of you may have remembered, said to me, "Remember, young man," and I was a young man then, I was all of 35, "the shortest unit of time at the Library of Congress is a decade." Well, in these 2 short units of time, Levon Avdoyan has created a magnificent collection. And while doing this, he has also written a number of books and articles, including one major book, Pseudo-Hovannes Memeconians, The History of Toran. He wrote the illustrated guide for the Near East collections that still is the most current guide to our collections. And then the catalog to know wisdom and instruction, the Armenian literary tradition at the Library of Congress. It's the catalog of the exhibition, and it basically is a guidebook to what he's done in the last 20 years. Anyway, this exhibit marks the 500th anniversary of movable type printing in Armenian. Lee has received several awards here at LC, and he received the Arthur H. Dadian Armenian Heritage Award from the Armenian Students Association in 1996. Now, for those of you who don't know, Arthur H. Dadian's widow, Marjorie Dadian, gave a very large donation, which is an endowment, the Arthur Dadian Fund, which supports Armenian studies here. Lee has written and lectured widely on Armenian historiography, and recently about bringing the Armenian world, or the world of Armenian studies, into the digital age. And he's also had and created the Vartnets Day Armenian Lecture Series, which began in '94 and which this year completed its 16th year. I could actually go on and on and on about this man, but without further ado, I'm going to let him talk about the collection he loves. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jane and Chris, and thank you all for coming. I truly appreciate it, and so that I do not try your patience too much, I've got my iPhone with its countdown, and I will time myself so that I don't wear out your welcome. When Dr. Deeb first told us about this new series of informal talks, she was quite explicit in her instructions. They were to be about the collections, and we were to have fun. And how could we not? Every day we have the chance to show off the items which we acquire, service, arrange for conservation, and hold in our hands. Yes, we can hold these in our hands. And if there is no time for us actually to read them, no matter. We have the fun, if we're really good and lucky, of making our researchers day by day connecting them with a source about which they previously knew absolutely nothing. Now, my colleagues and I deal with languages served by a variety of non-Roman alphabets. When I first arrived at the Library of Congress 35 years ago, many had already, thankfully, been removed from the miscellaneous or lesser-known language collections, but they are still known to those in the field, officially, unofficially, as the squiggly letter alphabets, hence my title. Now, my particular squiggly letter alphabet had its start in the early 5th century. It is its creation and the literary tradition and Armenian identity it fostered, which we are celebrating in the exhibit, which Chris mentioned, To Know Wisdom and Instruction, the Armenian Literary Tradition at the Library of Congress. This act of creation has a mystical relevance to all Armenians. In the late 4th century, about the same time the Greek church historian Sozomenes remarked that he had heard the Armenians were the first to accept Christianity as their state religion in the early years of that same century, the head of the Armenian church and the king of Greater Armenia ordered the monk Mesrop Mashtots to create an alphabet to aid in the further spread of the religion. That had also stopped in its tracks the imposition of the relatively new Pahlavi script used by the Zoroastrian Persian Empire, which at that time controlled about 4/5 of Greater Armenia, indicates that there was a political and cultural component as well, a thrust against cultural assimilation, as it were. Now, by tradition, the first words translated into Armenian after the creation of the alphabet were to know wisdom and instruction. Verse 1.2 of the book of Proverbs, and thus the title of the exhibition. The rush to translate things biblical and religious from Greek and Syriac was followed by the creation of native histories, geographies, patristic literature, medical tracts, and so on. Now, initially consisting of 36 letters, perfectly adapted to sound out the Armenian language. 2 more were added during the Cilician Armenian period, that is late 12th century to 1375. A pure O was added to replace a diphthong, and an F was added to replace the aspirated P. And I often wonder if this last change was due to their great crusading allies, the French, and their feeling of horreur when they were referred to as prank instead of franc. But since that time, we do have an F sound in the Armenian alphabet. The era of manuscripts and inscriptions had begun and lasted well past the year 1512, the date of the first printed Armenian book, the Urbata Girk, the Book of Fridays, printed by Jacob the Sinner in Venice. The spread of this new technology would not only ultimately create an enlightenment, one which I date to the 17th century, not the usual 18th century that other scholars do, and it led also to a renewed spirit of scholarship, and as well to a reformation in political life and thought throughout the extensive Armenian diaspora and in the homeland itself. Thus, the first 2 great eras of Armenian literacy, and we are now at the beginning of the third, the digital. No one knows where that will take us, nor what the final ramifications of it will be on our collections and on Armenian scholarship. The Library of Congress, however, intends to represent this era as well as it has the previous two. Now, to some extent, the Armenians have been part of the collections of the Library of Congress from its second creation in 1815. After the destruction of the Capitol, where the original Library of Congress was housed, by the British during the War of 1812, the library bought the personal library of President Thomas Jefferson and began anew. Jefferson was a scholar whose collection included many of those classical authors whose works described Armenia and the Armenians long before literature in the Armenian language was available. The library's acquisitions grew during the 19th century thanks to academic works of the many countries that either controlled portions of historic Armenia, such as Russia, or in which there were Armenian communities, such as Iran and India and the United States. Many of the invaluable works acquired in this century were also the creation of Armenian artists and authors, such as the magnificent photographs of the Ottoman Empire that fill the albums donated to the United States by Sultan Abdul Hamid II toward the end of that era. And here we see, from that collection, the Galata Tower in Constantinople, photographed by the three Armenian brothers known collectively as Abdullah Frere. Armenia's role in the military and political affairs of the next few decades guaranteed it a place in the non-Armenian written records of other nations and agencies. But aside from 17 calligraphy sheets acquired from the Armenian book dealer Kirkor Manasyan in the 1930s, and isolated Armenian language manuscripts and books published by the Armenian community of the United States and elsewhere, we estimate that only 200 or so items in the Armenian language were a part of the Library of Congress's collections by the end of World War II. From these early acquisitions, we have an exquisite, truly exquisite depiction of the Three Magi from a Haisma work, a synaxary, or the feast days of the Armenian Church. Note the formality of the kings and the actually charming simplicity of the stable animals, even breaking the border of the picture. This is counterbalanced also by items. These are evangelist portraits from a disbound 17th century Veteran or gospel book. And here we have a 17th century gospel book which was so badly damaged by water and fire that it was unusable. You can see the condition in the upper left-hand corner until our very brilliant conservation staff conserved it to its, well, truly beautiful present state. And I had hoped that the person responsible for that conservation would be here today, but obviously she had not made it, Ms. Tamara Ohanyan. Now, interest in the Middle East grew following the end of World War II. This interest led to the creation of the Near East section in 1945. Shortly after, in 1948, a group of Armenian American academics, businessmen, community leaders, and government employees gathered to create the Committee for the Armenian Collection of the Library of Congress. And here we see a slide. The committee and its chair, Mr. Arthur H. Dadian, presented 111 Armenian titles to then Librarian of Congress, Luther H. Evans, in that same year. Dadian described the undertaking. What we are trying to do is just a humble undertaking by a few citizens to help enrich the Armenian collection of our Library of Congress. We are doing this because we hope that the Armenian literature, portraying as it does the accomplishments and struggles of a heroic and peace-loving people, may have something of value to all Americans. We may safely date the beginning of an Armenian research collection at the Library of Congress to this committee's efforts. Its archives, held by the Near East section, end by 1952. Beginning in 1959, the Turkish area specialist Abraham Bordurian, a Turkish citizen of Armenian descent, added to the Armenian collections until his retirement in 1983, when the library estimated that the Armenian language collection numbered some 6,000 to 7,000 items. From 1983 until 1992, the new Turkish area specialist, Dr. Christopher Murphy, added to the collection as much as possible. I remember scurried conversations in the hallways about certain items. But it was a generous grant by Marjorie Dadian, Arthur Dadian's widow, from his estate and in his name, that enabled the library to hire its first Armenian area specialist. The appointment coincided with the establishment of a newly independent Armenia, and both the library's collections and the Republic of Armenia have grown together since that date. Now, all of this is by way of introduction to a tour of some of this squiggly lettered collection. We have gone from those 200 items in 1940s to an estimated 45,000 at the moment, or roughly 16,300 titles. The following are only a few, and not even all those presently in our exhibition, but I hope they illustrate the breadth of the collection and its utility to Armenian scholarship. Unlike our exhibit, there is no theme here, there is no story, other than the collection itself. Imagine that I have these in front of me right now, and that I am holding them in my hands, not your hands, in my hands, and I'm giving you my random thoughts on some of my favorite things within my time frame. Our first item is our earliest manuscript, which is a gospel book from Jerusalem, copied by the abbot Nerses from 1322 AD. It is very spare. The typical Armenian motifs are along the margins, but the illustrations are in brown ink. Beautiful, beautiful calligraphy. The cover, the original cover, is in damaged condition. You can see the incised leather, the jewels or beaded glass, and the silver has obviously been removed. This is followed by a recent acquisition, which we call the Noravank Gospels. To those of you familiar with monasteries in Armenia, this is not the famous Noravank. This is a gospel about 15 kilometers away from it. We bought this gospel book about 5 years ago, and the conservation department went wild when they saw it, especially, and they would have to describe to you why, but evidently there are pigments here that they had not seen this early before. It is dated to 1487, which is just 20 years before the first book. They have discovered some very intriguing things, and they are publishing and speaking about these. This to show you that we not only have these objects, but we use these objects to further scholarship. What I'd like you to pay attention to is the typical Armenian ornamented headpiece, and again, the typical Armenian marginal device. This is the incipit page from the Gospel of Matthew. We jump from there to our first printed book, which is known as the Voskan Bible because it was published by Voskan Yerevanci, Voskan of Yerevan, in Amsterdam in 1666. First, I should tell you that all of the books first published in the Armenian language were published in its extensive diaspora. You will see, however, in this one marvelous example, the first complete printed Armenian Bible, several tendencies that are known from publications, early publications, in whatever language. Typical Armenian unctual letters, this is the letter A, start the book of Exodus. But anyone with not even a practiced eye would notice that these illustrations are not typically Armenian. And indeed, the engravings were done by Christoph van Sichem, these two, and a relatively insignificant artist, Albrecht Dürer. What I mean to show by early printing, and the chief of the rare book division, Mark Domination, will certainly bear this out, is engravings traveled from place to place, fonts traveled from place to place. Nothing was wasted. Now we jump from there, and this is why I pointed out the Armenian artistic devices in manuscripts. This is a 1687 commentary on the Psalms, again published in Amsterdam. You'll see a wonderful Western engraving, typical Armenian manuscript devices which have now been translated into Armenian publishing. It's here I want to point out some other wonderful advances that this shows. The Psalms in this column are in what is known as grapar, classical Armenian. The commentary is in the spoken language, This is only the second time you see the vernacular used in an Armenian publication, and it's also natural because most of these were funded and produced for the use of merchants who obviously could not read the classical dialect. We jump to a non-Armenian photograph of an engraving by Joseph Pinel, done by Russian chalk, of what is known as the Armenian Convent. This is the monastery of San Lazzaro in the lagoon of Venice. It was founded in 1717 by Mkhatar Sebastatsi, Mkhatar of Sivas in modern-day Turkey, who was originally an Armenian cleric, ran afoul of the church, became a Catholic, and was given the right by the Pope to establish a Benedictine monastery on the island of San Lazzaro. This, and eventually its sister monastery in Vienna, became centers of Armenian publication, scholarship, and learning. They both are still existent, and we have made assiduous efforts to get as many of their publications as possible, including Mkhatar's own Bible from 1733, gorgeously hand-colored Bible, again, Western engravings, typical Armenian incipit letters, and this is open to the Book of Proverbs and to the very first words supposedly translated into Armenian to know wisdom and instruction. What I'd like to show you is that we're jumping between manuscripts and publications at the same time because they coexisted for centuries. Here we have one of two missals. These were copies of the Armenian liturgy, the Bararak, which were made for the use of the celebrant at the altar. This was not for the people, this was not to take home, this is actually a celebrant's copy. Both began with a gorgeous crucifixion, the Armenian headpieces, and the typical ornamented device. They also have ornaments throughout. And I rather facetiously say that one of these is used for, let's say, perhaps an intellectually challenged cleric to use at the altar, because his ornamental device throughout the text shows him exactly what he should be doing at that point in the liturgy. At this point, okay, raise the chalice. The other one, however, is much more decorative, and perhaps you will recognize the peacock from the second missal, which has become the leitmotif, if you will, of the Armenian exhibit, which is in the South Gallery. We go to a published liturgy. This was published in Rome in 1677. Notice again, it's the Armenian Catholic rite, Armenian letters, but this is clearly a Western illustration of the crucifixion, which makes sense also because it is a translation, as this is the Armenian Catholic community, of a publication of the Catholic Church. Another recent acquisition. Many Armenians who are here will tell you that the first time the Armenian liturgy's music was transcribed in European notations, in other words, not using the medieval notations, which the Armenians call the Khaz, was done by Malakia Yekmalian in the 19th century, followed by a very famous and beloved person in Armenian life and culture, Komidas Vatubet. That's not true. The first time the Armenian Mass, the Bararak, was transcribed into European notation was by Pietro Bianchini, who is the master of the chorus at the Monastery of San Lazzaro in Venice. His transcription was published in 1871. We recently acquired this gorgeous small manuscript of a hymn, Bianchini, set to four-part chorus and dedicated to the Armenian Catholic Patriarch at that time on his name day. Now, in the exhibit, we like to tell little mini stories. Here we're telling something from our collections and that of prints and photographs concerning St. John the Precursor, Sup Garabet in Armenian. In the upper left-hand corner, you have this 1719 first publication of the Patmuchun Tarono, the history of Taron, which supposedly tells the story of the Christianization of Armenia and St. Gregory, who you see in the engraving, imposition of this new religion on the king and the king's proclamation that Christianity would be the state religion. This actually is a 10th century forgery, which is more concerned with the coming of the relics of St. John the Precursor, St. John the Baptist, to Armenia, and most importantly, trying to establish the fact that St. Gregory actually created this monastery in the lower left, the monastery of St. John the Precursor in Mush, in Taron, at the same time as Etchmiadzin, which is now, of course, the equal to the papacy in Yerevan, is the head of the church. He attempted to establish primacy and legitimacy for it. Again, a calligraphy sheet from the Manassian collection. This is the feast day of Saint John the Precursor. Even though you see St. George and the dragon with the face, it is the feast day of St. John, and indeed the text of the calligraphy sheet and of the Heismerwerk, the Synexary, was taken from the history of Taron. And what is so special about this is the monastery you see in complete condition was destroyed circa 1915, with only about 8 feet of the wall still standing. On to another personal favorite. Sometime in the 17th century, Armenians began to produce manuscript and printed hamayils. These are phylacteries. They're collections of, highly ornamented collections of prayers, of sermons, of imprecations against the devils, against the demons. We acquired 2 printed hamayils from 1725, Constantinople. One was brilliantly conserved, as you can see, and put back into its original scroll format, and you can see this in the exhibit. The other, with Adam and Eve and other hand-colored illustrations, has been mounted in a 2-dimensional form. This practice lasted until, I'd say, the beginning of the 19th century. These were made to be roll tight, put in leather containers, and they were obviously for the road. An engraving of the eponymous hero of Armenia, Haik Nahabet, the man who supposedly gave the name Haik to the Armenians. You've got to know that the Armenians do not call themselves Armenian. They're known as Hai. Their country is Hayastan in antiquity, Hayotz Ashkar. This is from the first modern history of Armenia, the 3-volume Patmuchun Hayotz History of Armenia by Mikhail Chamchang, published in Venice in 1787. You can see Haik entering the new land, Mount Ararat in the background with the ark. There is another class of literature. Simplistically explained, it would be writing Turkish in Armenian script for those who could not read the Ottoman script. It's known as Armeno-Turkish or Hayadar Turkeren. It's now been shown by scholars such as Bedros Dermatiosyan at University of Nevada that this became a separate language unto itself, a separate intellectual movement, religious, informational, and also I was partial to this portrait, so I chose a 2-volume history of Napoleon Bonaparte. In the 19th century, we also saw a rise of wonderful journals. This is Basmaveb from the Makhataris Monastery in Venice. You can see Makhatar here, the island of San Lazzaro here. It's a wonderful philological literary journal which is still being published. And here, one of my personal favorites of our recent acquisitions, which is Cotton Cultivation in New Orleans, published in 1859 in Paris. Supposedly, this was published by an Armenian, a translation of the Manchester Cotton Works, to give the countrymen left back in Ottoman Turkey a way to improve their lot and their standards. But the historian in me is curious. 1859, Paris. France is, 2 years later, leaning toward the American Confederacy in our Civil War. Why? The cotton trade. As far as I know, we have no research done into Armenians in the cotton trade. It's just very suspicious to me. Now, we also have some items. I have not commented on the background of these slides until now because it and this silver and many other things were donated by the same donors, Sarah Northrup, Aram Martirosyan, and Sona Olsen, from their grandparents, possessions. They came from Mesre and Turkey. This is a sterling silver cigarette case. We don't know exactly where this was made, where David of Sassoon, the hero of the Armenian national epic, is appeared, and also Armenia Among the Ruins, a very iconic picture to Armenians. The silk fabric was circa 1915 from Mesre and the region of Kharpet, the region known for its fabric factories, again in the teens of the 20th century. Another recent acquisition is the first published administrative map of Yerevan. I have people from Armenia crowding around this map, trying to figure out where their streets are now. It is very rare and very unusual. It was published in November of 1920, and considering that the First Republic in which it was printed fell the last week of November 1920 and the first week of December 1920, it's invaluable, especially put together with another recent acquisition, this by donation by Mr. Roger Strauch and Julie Hulhanjan Strauch, of a map of Soviet Armenia from 1932 with an inset of Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. If you look, just compare what 12 years has done to the capital after the Sovietization. And so this is, again, an invaluable testament to what we use our collections for. In the 1930s, during the Depression, there was the WPA, the Works Projects Authority. One of these was to send Sidney Robertson Cowell to California to record and photograph the immigrant population while they were singing the songs that they would have sung in their home countries. You don't go to these songs if you're expecting professional musicians. You go to them if you want to hear how the songs were sung by the people in the home countries. Now, not only in their home countries, in the diaspora too. There are about 100 songs and pictures here. The one I have chosen for you to listen to today is known as Bostonia ach Chica, the girl from Boston. Let me just play a few lines for you. Okay, that's enough. Enough. I'll translate. The reason I really like this is obviously a farmer or a blue-collar worker who is bemoaning the fact that the girls, the Armenian girls of Armenia, no longer want men like him. They want doctors and lawyers. All of this can be yours online. All of these songs are mounted. As with the Jewish population, so too the Armenians, when they came over to their new homes, they wrote about the villages and the places they left behind. We have several of these, I think about 100, and there must be about only 300 to 400 of Armenian, as opposed to there are thousands, I believe, in the Jewish tradition. This one I chose not only because I'm from Kharpet, yes, Kharpetia, but also because many of the items that we are displaying in the exhibit are from Kharpet. This is a huge volume on Kharpet, the Golden Plains of Kharpet, published in New York in 1959. Here we see those same factories where I mentioned the fabrics, etc. We see a carpenter and stonemasons. As far as Soviet publications are concerned, one of my favorites from 1961 is this illustration from the publication of the Armenian national epic, Sassoonsi David, David of Sassoon. That's only one title. This was, again, an oral epic until the 19th century when some of it was transcribed, but it was only in Soviet periods that the entire part was transcribed and the Soviet scholars attempted to reconstruct a coherent whole. It works. But I think the illustrations by Khudroyan are just splendid. When the Soviets wanted to, they could produce magnificent works, such as this. This is what started modern Armenian literature. This is Khachitur Abovyan's Verkayastani, The Wounds of Armenia, or Armenia's Wounds. It was published in 1848, and we indeed have the original publication. but I chose to display both in the exhibit and here the Soviet publication of 1959 because graphically I think it's just splendid. This is the last slide. You'll say, okay, now he's been chronological up till now. Why does he say this is the last slide? Couldn't he, couldn't he end with something more with it? And also stop banging the microphone. This is again the very Noravank Gospel. And it is a splendid gospel. It is important from 1487, both because of the pigment analysis and its intrinsic artistic merit, and also for the fact that it has an extended colophon, a Hishitakaran, in other words, the narration of the scribe who copied it, and a very important mention of the Turkoman overlord of that region of Armenia at the time, Yaqub Bey of the White Turks. Very rare. But the reason I mention that is it's the future, if the future operates fast enough. Because if you go to the cataloging record for the Verin Noravank Gospel, and here it is, and go halfway down, you'll see these two links, one in PDF and one page view. And the page view will give you the entire manuscript for you to read. And this is what I mean about the future. The Library of Congress, both through its online catalog and through the World Digital Library, is mounting free of charge with its policy of open access to everyone around the world, items from all of our collections. And obviously, we have to move slowly when you have something like 155 million items to deal with. But this and Mikhail Chamchan's History of Armenia are already mounted, and I am pleased to end by telling you that all the copyright-free items in the exhibit to know wisdom and instruction, the Armenian literary tradition at the Library of Congress, will be fully digitized and mounted both on our online catalog and the World Digital Library, I would say within the year. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and invite a question or two, but first by telling you that we are being webcast, which means if you do ask a question, you will be implicitly telling us that it's okay for you to appear in that webcast. So with that in mind, are there any questions? Yes, ma'am.
This might be too controversial, but I had the pleasure of living both in Armenia and Georgia, and I'm intrigued about the connections between the two squiggly alphabets. I realize that there are strong views on this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I'm just going to play the ancient historian and tell you by the only ancient source we have, which is Koryun biography of Mesrop Mashtots, the monk who created the Armenian alphabet. That testifies to the fact that Mesrop created also the Georgian and the Albanian, the Caucasian Albanian alphabet. I realize that this is very confrontational. I have my personal views about it, but I think, you know, I would better refer you to sources before I say that. Yes?
Since you mentioned the historian, would you please also mention his date?
He's late 5th century. Yes?
No, I'm concerned about the digitizing part. Well, I'm not concerned, but curious. My understanding from the past, when they were digitizing books, the older books, because they were becoming brittle, the actual book was not being kept.
Oh.
So,
Well, let me guarantee.
they are not taking it apart to digitize.
Sure. Well, at this point, I'm going to do a non sequitur. I'm going to recognize you, Lola Pickering, a former acquisition specialist here. I am going to recognize and thank Beverly Gray, obviously, for being here. I am going to thank our Armenian, Georgian, Amharic, etc., cataloger and acquisition specialist, Dr. Paul Krigo. I am going to greet Ambassador Evans and Mrs. Rita Balian, and Councilor Kajoyan, I think, is here from the Armenian Embassy, since they came in during the speech. And I'm going to answer your question by saying, over my dead body. And that of the entire division. There is not a person here who would agree to that. Now, I'm going to do that with a caveat. If there is a work which is literally falling apart, there is no way to keep it as, or to service it. I guarantee you it will be kept in some manner. It may not be given to something, but it will be kept in some manner.
On the first question, obviously this is not a big Ethiopian population, and anytime I see the alphabet on the storefronts, it looks to me just like an inverted form of the Armenian alphabet. Can you just speak to that?
Yes. It's not that I'm afraid to say that something influenced something. I'm a historian that believes in strict objectivity. Our background, our primary source, does not indicate that happened. I'm not discounting that it could have happened, since ancient communities were not static. They traveled, especially religious communities traveled. There are, Armenians were in Jerusalem, for instance, from the 4th century on, clerical things. Who knows what they brought back? By the way, did you all hear the question? The question was the possible influence. The first question was the relationship between the Armenian and Georgian alphabets. And the third question was, is there any influence of the Ethiopian, the Amharic gaze alphabet on Armenian? You've got to remember, with the exception of the shapes of the modern Georgian alphabet, that all of these alphabets were based on the sequence of the Greek alphabet. And if you look at many of them, you will see that they are adapted from Greek antecedents. I think you will find, and there are studies that keep going on about this or that, and some very, very persuasive studies about where these came from. We can have all the theories we can in the world, but there is nothing in the primary record, source record, to illustrate that, yet. I think we have time for a couple more. Are there any more questions? Yes?
Mr. Avdoyan, I think this has been the fourth part of the exhibition, with the structure, the Armenian exhibition LOC. Just wondering if there's any statistics how many people were able to see.
I'm going to give you some facts, and I think you can make up your own mind. We printed 30,000 brochures. They've been gone. Unfortunately, we will not have any brochures for the final run of the exhibit, which closes on September 26th. As of 2.5 weeks ago, by count of the guards that are in front of the gallery area, over 205,000 visitors were counted to the gallery area, which had the Jefferson and the Armenian exhibits. So while I can't say that 205,000 people had visited the exhibit, we can say that up to that amount have, and I can also say that I take a rather proprietary viewpoint of this exhibit, and I walk through it once or twice a day, and it has been a joy to see people crowding in there. Everyone has commented this, looking, talking, listening at the listening stations. So while I can't give you an exact figure, I can tell you that it has been very popular, very successful, and people have left comments with our visitor service office. They've told me that they are getting many, many positive comments about it. Yes?
Will you be traveling, will you make this travel to Michigan, Fresno?
Well, first off, Michigan will open its own exhibit on October 18th. No, I'm not going to restart it. On October 18th. Secondly, traveling exhibits are very expensive. Not only do you have the cost of transportation, you have the cost of insurance. It's really, one of the things about this exhibit, it belongs to its design, and its design belongs to it. I now view them as an integral unit. There is no way that this exhibit could travel. The items might be able to travel, but not this exhibit. We were talking about this, Dr. Deeb and Dr. Murphy and I. We are retaining the panels and the reproductions, and it's conceivable we would lend them out to churches and other organizations that might want to display those, but it's just too expensive to lend these items. So unfortunately, we say no. However, as of last Friday, the complete online exhibit is available, and you can see every one of the items plus the complete captions. I think we have time for one more. Okay, two more. I see two there. The gentleman and then Miss Ballion. Could you speak up, please?
I would say most of the Western historiography is quite deficient when it comes to understanding this, which is part of the Theophanic language. Where, for instance, the movement of monks
Yes.
from Theophanic Armenia and from Armenia into Palestine and Ethiopia is quite extensive.
Yeah, that's what. That is what I mentioned, sir, about the movement of populations.
So basically the question of these alphabets is an area that is further studied, as so far it has been looked at only from the Western and Latin sources.
Except that the Armenians are not Western, and there's a great deal of literature on it. Thank you. Basically, I'm not arguing with him. The gentleman reinforced what I said, was there are movement of populations, religious populations, and his argument was that the issue of the alphabets has been studied only by Western scholars, but it's been extensively studied by Armenian scholars, who are basically not Western scholars. Mrs. Ballion, and then we have to end.
Yes, so where do you consider the cradle of the Indo-European language?
Oh.
Because 2 days ago I was reading that it started in Anatolia, which is historical Armenia, but the reference was going to Turkey, and not
Well,
Armenia.
that was corrected, Rita.
Could you
Certainly. This is something that actually dates back a long time ago. The traditional scholarship on the Indo-European language says that it was the first people to use the Indo-European language were the Kurgan Scythian people in the steppes of Russia. Beginning even before Tomag Gamkrilidze in Georgia, people were wondering, based on agrarian scholarship, whether actually the first Indo-Europeans grew out of the lands of Anatolia. Notice it's Anatolia, not necessarily the Armenian highlands. We know, for instance, the Hittites spoke an Indo-European language. The new results are based on botany, and I must tell you, I am not a botanist, so I cannot fully understand it. These are theories, and I'm not prepared to say one or the other. I'm not prepared to give up the Scythian genesis and to advocate the Anatolian until I know more and am able to really get at the data. But they use the term, and they admit this, Turkey, because it is in modern-day Turkey. Just as you would say some of the remains, Indian remains, are in the United States. No one actually said it was Turkey. Nor did they say it was Armenian. No, we're talking about thousands of years ago. And indeed, one of the things that, as you know, there is in the Armenian scholarship itself is, were the Armenians native to the land, or was there an immigration of Indo-European tribes from outside? This does not preclude that second possibility, because Indo-European languages could have arisen in Anatolia. These tribes could have emigrated out of that area and then come back in. We simply don't know. It's fascinating. But what they're saying is in the ancient area of Turkey. But I think this is all wonderful. I think All of the static history that we have is now being stirred up by these theories, by DNA. For instance, I have had both sides of my ancestry run and DNA defined again. So we're at an exciting age. And I'm hoping, one, that you all will come and use some of our sources to examine that age, and that two, after you're done listening to me pontificate, those of you who have not will pay a visit to the exhibit, which will be up until September 26th. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Well, I would like to thank Lee for a both entertaining and very enlightening presentation, and to thank you all for coming, and hopefully you will come to our next in mid-September and the following items. Again, many thanks and good afternoon.
Thank you, Chris.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.